As credit expert of the Sparkassen Finanzgruppe, we support an open dialogue. We want to provide a stage for current socially relevant topics, and I think that's exactly what we can do together here today, to discuss a current and socially extremely relevant topic. So it's great to have you here, and we are really looking forward to our cooperation in the innovation series Tech4Society, which starts here today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Lars, and don't worry, we're not getting tired with introductions. Daniela and I, Daniela is a policy fellow with DPZ, and my name is Florian. I'm the head of the structural change program at DPZ, and we will give you a little background on kind of like the framing of Tech4Society, what it is about, and why we're all here together. But we keep it very brief because we got a very distinguished set of speakers here. We're looking forward to hearing how Tech4Societies can be built, and especially how value creation is changing today. But first of all, thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks so much to the SKPlab for hosting all of us today, and thanks to all of the partners. Yeah, there they are. Thanks for all of the partners and their very valuable contributions and their input, which have helped us bringing not just this event together, but also a whole series of events, which is to follow next year. So today we're talking about technologies, and often we only start talking about them once they've already become a part of our daily life, and only then we usually start thinking about the social implications of them. And I think all of us know that the internet is probably the best example for that, and policymakers and society have been playing a catch-up with the internet and with the innovations that the internet brought about since we really all started going online around, well, let's say 2 decades ago. But in the meantime, the internet has challenged and changed all of our lives, and it has brought huge advantages, not just to individuals, but also to businesses. And but it also has serious downsides to it, fake news and the exploitation of personal data for commercial purposes, just to name a couple of them. So with Tech4Society, we want to be ahead of the curve, and we want to have conversations about new technologies, and mostly, and more importantly, figuring out ways how we can use these new technologies in a way so that they are first most serving society and the people. And together with our partners, we have put a lot of thinking in how we can do this, and we've come up with a magic triangle, and it's not that magic actually, but with 3 dimensions which we want to explore as part of this series and in a series of workshops next year. So the first one is an economic dimension, and here it's quite clear that the key parameters of our economies are shifting, and a lot of this has to do with new technologies. And as we know from past industrial revolutions, along with changes and opportunities come significant social challenges. And today we can see parallels of key economic indicators with those during the first industrial revolution in the 19th century. These include high levels of social and economic inequalities, low productivity gains, and also a low labor share. And back then, the benefits of new technologies materialized throughout society only once societies and politics started figuring out, finding a consent, and put social institutions in place which helped making technologies work for everyone. And these included, for instance, universal healthcare, but also introducing safety standards at work and getting rid of child labor and so on. So that means that major shifts in the economy, and especially the way how value is created, which is why we're using this topic as the start and the initiation of Tech4Society is always linked to a question of social justice. The second dimension is that so far the age of automation has been a rough ride for the working classes, especially in developed economies. Automation has in parts diminished opportunities for the working class, especially for parts of society which feel sort of disconnected and not in touch with the social and economic gains that not just new technologies are producing, but that globalization as large is currently producing. It's, for instance, not a coincidence that there's 4 times as many robots in Michigan than there is at the West Coast. And as we know, Donald Trump did a very good, or achieved a very good result in Michigan. So as back in the 19th century, we can expect that people will express their discontent if the benefits of technological advancements do not work for everyone. Maybe they do it differently today than back in the 19th century, where people took to the streets. Today it's more likely that people express their discontent at the ballot box. And I don't think we are kind of suggesting there's a link between new technologies and populism, but it's a fact that politics in Western societies has become a lot more fragmented, and that some of the societal debates have become a lot more polarized, which makes it a lot more difficult to solve some of the big societal challenges that we want to talk about as part of this series. The third dimension is that there are also kind of high uncertainties for individuals that come along with the opportunities, especially during times when foundations of our economies are shifting. This has consequences for each of us, and we often find ourselves trapped in the discourses between tech hysteria and tech hype. So this all means that technological change must not be an end in itself. New technologies need to tackle the big challenges of our time, and these challenges need to be solved by bold thinking, practical solutions that work for everyone, and forming broad alliances in society. And this is what Tech4Society is really about. And at this stage, I'll pass over to Daniela, because having this consortium for DPZ also means that we are exploring new territory and having partnerships with the private sector. And Daniela, with her background at Volkswagen and also being a policy fellow here at DPZ, will tell you more about how we want to make these partnerships work.
Thank you. I'll try to keep that brief now, but just to include the more organizational corporate perspective into this, the questions that Florian just raised. I would argue that companies today largely know how to manage stakeholders. That is something almost every bigger corporation at least does. But we, in our discussions before starting this whole dialogue series and working on the paper, we came to the conclusion that companies need to go beyond managing stakeholders and need to go beyond that approach, especially when we all as a society face so-called wicked problems, problems that cannot be solved by one product or one technology, and that need to be approached on a more systemic level. And not only talking to stakeholders, but acting with stakeholders. That was sort of the step we want stakeholder management to go after this series. By the way, companies will then, if they agree to a more proactive role here in an earlier stage, also be better able to see themselves as stakeholders in a societal process. So not just putting themselves at the center and looking out into the periphery, who might be affected by what I decide to do, but also realize that they themselves are stakeholders in the larger societal process. So stakeholder management has to sort of evolve, become something that is closer to open innovation, closer to collective intelligence. We'll get back to that later as well. And in our paper, we talk about a license to co-innovate. There is talk about a license to operate for businesses to be eligible parts of society and to be eligible to operate on their terms. But a license to co-innovate would mean that corporations, companies become eligible partners for societal stakeholders in innovation processes. So partners in that innovation we need for societies. The idea of co-innovation is, as Florian just said, in fact reflected in our Tech4Society consortium. We have partners from the private and public sector, civil society and academia. And it is also reflected in the format of the working paper that has been laid out in the front and on the tables. You'll find space for notes on the last page, and we would love to if you would share those notes with us one way or another after this event series. And we're also hoping to build on your ideas over the course of the events that Florian just mentioned for the next year. So that would be our introduction. And welcome again to everybody. I'm very happy now to welcome our keynote speaker to the front, Geoff Mulgan. For those who haven't read his piece in yesterday's Tagesspiegel Background Digital on Tech for Fortschritt, please listen closely. For everyone else who read the piece, look forward to an elaboration on his thoughts about changing value creation in the digital age. Welcome, Geoff.
Okay. Vielen Dank, Daniela, Florian und Lars. Es tut mir leid, aber ich muss Englisch sprechen. But I am very grateful for the excuse to escape a painful general election which is happening in Britain, which I hope we won't talk about at all. What I'm going to talk about is in part technology for society. I say we are now at least 60 years into the digital era. The first microprocessors, satellites, computers, remember, were built in the 1950s. So this is not something very new. And yet, as both Florian and Daniela said, there's still a remarkable imbalance. I'm just going to give a 30-second advertisement here for a book I've written, which is published next week, on social innovation. And part of its theme is the strange imbalance in brain power, which means that we put huge amounts of brain power money into military innovation. In the US, it's more than 50% of all public R&D is military. A huge amount into commercial innovation, and only a tiny amount into social innovation. And this creates some of the huge imbalances we have around AI and automation, or loneliness or unhappiness, which the internet actually exemplifies, an extraordinary technology that's transformed all our lives. In the period when the internet became mainstream in the US, the proportion of people who had no one to turn to for important issues rose from 8% to 25%. So there was a chronic degradation of social relationships, even as society was become connected. And then we had trolling, fake news, all these other things. But no organizations felt it was their job to innovate to solve those social problems, even as vast sums were spent on better ways of doing click-through advertising and so on. So that's why social innovation matters. But what I'm going to do is talk a bit about some perhaps more economic issues, and I will crane your necks a little bit, and I'll go quite quickly through a lot of material, but some of which I hope we can go back to. And 4 minutes each on digital and value, wealth and jobs, 4 minutes on policy for digital, what should governments be thinking about in terms of platforms and programs, and then how can digital be used for policy or for the work of government. So somewhat different. So first of all, digital and value. Here is a little picture of the new patterns of value. This is a chart, if you don't know, it shows that intangible investment is now bigger than tangible investment for at least the last 10 years or so across the developed world. The whole shape of our economy has shifted. It is now about platforms, about algorithms, about data, and if you look at the most valuable companies on the planet, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and now Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei would be there. They are almost all based on the intangible economy, platform business models, data harvesting business models, and so on. This is a huge shift in the nature of the economy. And all the shifts to as-a-service models, so mobility, music, security, as a service, completely different way of thinking about value compared to traditional manufacturing, retailing, and so on. There is a new geography of power there, but also a new geography of values. This is a diagram we will be publishing in January, a whole series of analyses of AI research across the world. This particular one shows specialization in AI surveillance topics, things like facial recognition. And as you can see, China, massive investment in AI for surveillance and often for supporting very totalitarian values. And of course, there's a parallel, more commercial side in the US. So I think we're also seeing a huge shift of geopolitics, but also values embedded in technologies. On a more positive side, the change of shape of the economy we've analysed in the UK, looking at creative jobs, jobs which are creative either in creative industries, like design, advertising, but also creative jobs outside those industries, which are actually about the same number and growing much faster than the workforce as a whole. So although these are still a minority, there is a big shift towards these more creative jobs, and a city like Berlin obviously is right in the forefront of this. And right across the economy, if we look at what skills will be more in demand in 8 to 10 years' time, again, you can look at the detailed analysis underpinning this. It's things like judgment, fluency of ideas, systems thinking, originality. These are the skills you will need even if you have a job which may appear far away from this, like plumbing or construction or working in a warehouse. And a key issue for education systems is, are they preparing young people for these skills, or for that matter, people being displaced from traditional manufacturing and service jobs too. Second main theme, and I'm going very fast, I appreciate this, is policy for digital. And I think just as Florian mentioned, in the 19th century, we had, in the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution happened, it revealed all sorts of gaps of governance, all sorts of missing institutions, rights, and so on. We've got something equivalent here, and I think the fourth Industrial Revolution is leaving what I call governance sinkholes. These are where sort of technology and its economy has shifted, governance hasn't shifted, and you can see these through crises and problems. And almost everything digital turns out to be a sinkhole. Crises of privacy, of data, of regulation, of tax avoidance, you name it. And so a whole series of new issues are coming to the fore, from competition policy and the platforms, to reskilling and automation, to shaping R&D towards public benefit, and I hope we can come back to that, to new structures for global governance. There's a sort of bottom-up grassroots movement, which I think needs to be part of this picture, the digital social innovation field. There's well over 2,000 organizations across the EU linked up, digitally innovating new ways of doing healthcare, or democracy, or learning, or making. And this is a new geography of digital social innovation worth attending to. But also all sorts of issues which are very live around data, where in the last 10 or 20 years we've had this essentially predatory model of data harvesting from people. And one of the things we've been working on is what might be the new regime for the next 10 or 20 years. And I won't, you'll be glad to see, go through this in detail, but we've been looking at all the different kinds of data about us, some of which we have control over, some of which we don't, some of which have very personal value, some of which have huge potential public value. And a quite new landscape is coming into being where the current structures don't fit it at all, either in business or in government. And we've been advocating a new really ecosystem of institutions, different kinds of data trusts, data co-ops, data mutuals to manage this data, both to protect our privacy, but just as important to get the maximum public value out of linking data up so we can solve problems of unemployment, ill health, climate change, and so on. And a related issue for governance is what to do about AI and regulation. A few years ago, I wrote a sort of outline for what I thought was a new regulator needed for AI, covering everything from flash trading in finance to facial recognition. The government actually created something a little bit similar to that. This is a new UK government body whose job is to be a meta-regulator. And again, they're looking at issues like micro-targeting to establish what the rules should be, what the norms should be. And there's a lot of movement at a global level. Macron and Trudeau announced this. It was the International Panel on AI. It's now been renamed the Global something. And I think in the next few years, we will see a lot of creativity designing the right institutions to make sure we get the benefits from AI, which are huge, but without all the things which can go wrong on bias, bad data, predatory behaviors, and so on. This is very urgent, and I think is moving very fast. And then finally, digital for policy. One of the reasons we're very lucky is that the tools available to a government or for a political program are very different from 10 or 20 years ago. But I think in much of the world, governments don't seem to know that. They still are using very traditional methods, hardly even aware we are 60 years into the digital era. And so one of the things we've been looking at is how do you turn a society, a city, into something more like a brain, like as we heard earlier, something more like a collective intelligence, able to use all of the brain power, the insights, the ideas of citizens to solve problems. We have probably 100 billion or so going in at the moment into AI applications, from IBM Watson to Google DeepMind, driverless cars, and things like Smile to Pay in China, where you just smile at the screen and your bank account is debited automatically, which is probably the most dangerous invention of recent years. We don't yet quite have it in Europe. But anyway, we're interested in the slightly different side of this, as the innovations which tap into human intelligence at large scale, often reinforced by technology. So things like very familiar ones like Wikipedia, which is now pretty old hat, all the things in science like Zooniverse, which has millions of people finding new stars, and things like Waze, which has citizen-generated data integrated with data. And so where that takes us to is really thinking almost any policy topic in terms of mobilizing different kinds of collective intelligence to solve problems. How do you systematically organize the data and observations, the analysis, the memory, the creativity, judgment, and wisdom? And if you're interested, about a month ago, we put out a whole sort of methodology we've been developing with the United Nations on how you use collective intelligence methods for the SDGs, for problem solving on everything from access to water to gender inequality, child mortality, using all the extraordinary array of both data tools but also human intelligence to solve problems. A live example on that, which I think is relevant to Germany and on which we're working with a number of Scandinavian countries, is applying this to labour markets. So as millions of people face a risk of losing their jobs, needing to reskill, how do we provide the best available data on current jobs, future jobs, changing demand, what new job you could get with an extra piece of skill? And we're trying to show in practice what it means to turn that kind of collective intelligence into a commons, into a public good to help the labour transitions of the next 10 or 15 years. And I think this is both difficult but also exciting, and the options are radically different from 10 years ago. The same applies to the just transition and decarbonisation. We will in the next couple of months have the announcements from the European Commission on its Green Deal. We have plenty of examples in this country like Freiburg, radically decarbonised urban examples. This is a social innovation example here from Seoul, neighbourhoods where tens of thousands of people pool energy, use solar power, share in the savings, but also radically reduce carbon footprints. And this is just a picture from Citra's work on circular economy. But the key thing I want to get over is that the new Green Deal of the next 5 or 10 years and implementation of the Paris agreements is also a chance to think of what are the digital supports which mobilize collective intelligence, so we do that well. And next week I'll be publishing a thing linking, so trying to set out some of the ideas of how you apply collective intelligence to Europe-wide decarbonisation, on data, experiments, challenges, and so on. As I won't go through that now, but I think this is an exciting opportunity to embody a different way of thinking about government and organising change, and linking the top down and the bottom up. So every neighbourhood, every family can play a part in shaping the future using digital tools. So you map your own, consumption behaviour, energy patterns and so on, but also can be part of the experimentation around radical new ways of cutting food waste, changing transport, etc., and hopefully creating all sorts of new jobs through that transition too. This final slide, and I think this was my last line in the Tagesspiegel piece, is really why I think it matters so much that we get smarter about Tech4Society and the links between digital and social goals. So as I said, if you look at the history of AI, which is 50 years old, the first sort of big gatherings on AI were literally in the mid-1950s, huge amounts has been invested since then in AI, some purely academic, a lot for the military to help target drones and missiles, and in the last 10 years a huge amount in business. It's only just now we're beginning to have systematic commissioning of AI for social goals. We in Nesta now run several funds for the UK government doing that, commissioning AI for schools, or to help precarious workers in the labour market, or to try and create new news services. But this is very, very recent. It's remarkable how rare it still is to have systematic mobilization of advanced digital tech for social goals. And I think in the next 50 years, this is the big question, really. And in a way, you see this in our popular culture, you see it in science fiction. If you talk to kids, they're very aware of this. What will life be like when we're surrounded by incredibly smart technologies, which can dominate us, can ruin our lives? How do we ensure through that transition, that digital transition which goes parallel to the carbon transition, how do we ensure the technologies embody our values, are accountable to us, are designed in ways that serve our interests? And I think this will be the single biggest, perhaps one of the 2 or 3 biggest political issues of the next 50 years. So really good you're having this discussion here. And even if some of our actions now are on a more modest scale, just look a generation out and they will all be amplified and the stakes will be massively higher a generation from now. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff. And I don't know if you are familiar with that mantra of das progressive Zentrum. It's Vordenken, Vernetzen, Streiten. So think ahead, network, and argue. And now tonight's response to Geoff's proposal or thoughts won't necessarily lead to an argument, but will certainly stir up the discussion and look deeper into the democratic systems and societal formats and models we need. I'm very happy to welcome Patrizia Nanz, who will be giving this response.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much, Geoff, for your wonderful talk. I think I can say it for myself, but probably for most of you, that your work and the work of Nesta has been of great inspiration to me and probably to you all. I think at the end of your talk, you quite hinted to the big political question, which I think we have to solve when thinking about technology for society. So, and the title also says it, perhaps we can bring it back. The title of this event is Tomorrow's Value Creation, and it hints to a very important thing, namely the fact that today's economic value changes dramatically and already will change even more. And so perhaps we have to better look into exactly how this change has come about. When we were kids, we thought of economic values very much being tangible. We thought of objects and services, something everyone could rely to, right? And everyone could grasp, basically. Whereas today, the growing part of economic value is connected to data, and how the data is handled and how it's sold. So it's not just Google and Facebook and Amazon selling their data for marketing purposes. It's also the data design within objects like cars or your phone or the electricity in your home, right? So this value is much more hidden to most of us, to most of the citizens, because we don't quite understand what it really creates, what it causes, and Geoff talked about exactly that, and what's shared in the value chain, and how actually this impacts our everyday life. So we know it exists, but we do not fully grasp or understand the implication for our living together, right, or living everyday life. And therefore, given that we don't know exactly about the impacts of these technologies, it's very difficult for citizens to take control, democratic control over these developments. You hinted at this point. So today, governments are very much struggling to find ways for taxing and bringing in line these technological developments with democratic values. Values like individual freedom, the right to privacy, fairness of treatment, etc. So by the way, the states are not external of this development, but very much part of this chain. Think of, you have mentioned it, facial recognition, mentoring the traffic, security administration, health administration, and so on. So the state is not an external to these developments, which is very important to understand if we want to think about the state. Of course, many of you are aware that the European Union, and also you mentioned the Green New Deal, but apart from the Green New Deal, there is lots of things going on in terms of regulation. So you have the European General Data Protection, which is quite something already, but it's not enough, I think, for if we think about democratic control of this technological development. Control is perhaps not the right word. I would rather say shaping together this value-based development. And to find a way how democracy can meaningfully shape this technological developments. So we need to bring the issue of tomorrow's value creation into the public debate. I think that today you started this with this debate. Of course, there are not hugely a number of people here, but it's still a beginning. But I do believe that we have to go out of this bubble. Yeah? This is not enough. I mean, many of you are already aware of what's going on, and I think we have to systematically think how the state could generate a systematic conversation about the development of technology. And basically, I think there are two ways of doing it, right? One is the systematic facilitation of citizens. And if we look at France, for example, at this very moment until January, you may be aware of it, there was a citizen convention on climate, la Convention citoyenne sur la transformation, sur la transition écologique. And until January, they're producing proposals to the government. And there are 150 randomly selected citizens doing that on a very highly complex issue. Of course, they are supported by experts, and the process seems to be very well designed and very well facilitated. You need this in order to have a good outcome of these processes. And so in the end, they will produce policy recommendations and perhaps even sort of frame laws on which either the parliament will decide or it will be put to referendum, right? So this is one way of doing it, and you can still see at the moment on YouTube that there are quite interesting ideas coming out from this process, how to tackle climate change. This is a way of using sort of the intelligence and creativity of citizens to come about solutions. That's one way. The other way is a new type of value being produced concretely on small scale. The thinking behind is very much what we do at my institution. So what we think is that there is no blueprint for the grand transformation we're going through. This transformation will be very, very big and deep. But there are many transformations already on the ground, as you can I've heard before me that there are many sort of ideas and many innovations already happening. So And I think we should really do our best to learn as much as we can on the smaller scale to see where we're collectively heading. So incrementally come up with learnings from these sort of small-scale innovations and transformations to be able to see what it means for policymakers at the national and transnational level. So, for example, for many people, many citizens, the automation of work is still quite abstract, but of course on many regions like Baden-Württemberg or Lyon, it's already happening quite a lot on many other places in the world. So we need to organize ourselves to learn collectively and increasingly to know what it means for policymaking at higher political levels. So I think we need to rethink how we collectively can learn. So not as in terms of a case study, as scientists always do, but more in terms of learning process that involve different decision makers, private and public, and of course citizens, to understand what it means collectively for our policy making. So this is an approach of learning and policy making which is rather different from the regular one where experts are very much at the center. But if we do it systematically, I'm absolutely certain that this will be the way forward. And this would mean to rethink the state, and I think you hinted at this, because today I think that the state is not able to deal with these developments. And one of the reasons is probably its operational system, its culture and organization, which is very much determined by a Weberian hierarchical idea of functioning. Which is not very much conducive to systemic and integrative way of tackling big problems and developments. So we would need a state which would work very much more like a platform where governance is facilitating and steering innovation and collective learning. And I think we should go into this direction. So government needs to help draw from expertise, ideas, and energy outside themselves, very much like Amazon is doing already, right? So as you told us, this can be done also for social innovation, and this would be a systemic mobilization which will be steered or facilitated by a state being a platform. And this would, of course, mean a change of the system of politics, and a change of the culture of the administration. And they would need to see their own mission quite differently from today. But I do believe that this rethinking how the system of the political system is absolutely crucial if we want to survive as a democracy and as a meaningful democracy in the digital age. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrizia Nanz. We're going to keep adding people and adding perspectives, and I would now welcome our panel. Please have a seat on top of the stairs here. You can climb over that one box we have below. Yes. And there's also water for everybody.
Yeah, water is good.
Who needs one. Just about the idea of the panel, we will basically discuss what Geoff and what Patrizia proposed, or we will discuss their statements right now from additional perspectives. We'll have about 40 minutes for that, and I will after that open up for Q&A with you, with the audience, so be prepared to have a slot to ask your questions. And we'll have also closing remarks then, which will today come from Scandinavia by Juha Leppänen, who is the Chief Executive of Demos Helsiki and also one of our partners. While I'm at it, I'll just sort of start with the introduction I didn't properly do when Geoff started having the keynote and Patrizia doing the response. So, Geoff is co-chief of the expert group on innovation and entrepreneurship at the World Economic Forum and a visiting professor at LSE, UCL, and the University of Melbourne. From 1997 to 2004, he was, among others, Director of Policy under the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Now Geoff is Chief Executive Officer of Nesta, the worldwide leading think tank concerned with innovation and social transformation. You heard the keynote. I think you had an idea of what that impressive CV led to. Then also Patrizia, giving the response. Patrizia is Scientific Director at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. She researches on necessary conditions for societal change, what we also just heard about. She is co-chair of the scientific platform Nachhaltigkeit 2030, Sustainability 2030, and professor for transformative sustainability at University of Potsdam. So thank you too once again. And then I would like to welcome on the panel Julia Kloiber. Julia is partner at Ashoka and managing director and co-founder of Superrr Lab. We would describe her as a tech visionary for social entrepreneurship, if that's something you could also confirm. She's an advisor to governments and businesses in digital strategies. Previously, Julia has worked with international nonprofits such as the Mozilla Foundation and the Open Knowledge Foundation. Welcome, Julia. And last but not least, we welcome Stefan Profit and with him politics to this panel. Stefan is Deputy Director General in the Economic Policy Department of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. His directorate deals with macroeconomic developments, economic analysis and projections, and during previous assignments in the ministry, Stefan was in charge of a unit focusing on the empirical research in the field of inclusive growth, productivity and investment. And prior to working for the federal government, Stefan worked for the Bertelsmann Foundation. So welcome to the panel. Maybe that's worth a short applause. Geoff, I would like to start off by giving you the possibility to just briefly respond to Patrizia's thoughts on your input.
I agreed with them all.
I agree with them all.
And I mean, maybe this is what we can open up a discussion on. Essentially, I think, how does one redefine both a state and a democratic system which is fit for the times we are in? And for slightly different historical reasons, if you are living in an advanced society like this, you've essentially inherited forms of democracy which are late 19th century, basically. The idea of democracy means you vote every 4 or 5 years, send people to sit in a parliament. There are some national parties who have platforms, and they form a government. And that, I say, that's a model of democracy which was invented, I say, really crystallized in the second half of the 19th century. And if we were inventing democracy today, it wouldn't look like that at all. It would be much more like some of the emerging innovations you can see at the city level or in East Asia and so on, where there is much more active public discussion, shaping of topics, where expertise is drawn in from the whole society, not just from the parties and the civil service, where there is constant deliberation, improvement, and engagement, mobilizing the collective intelligence of the people. So I hope maybe we can explore that a little bit. Then the other side of the coin is the forms of the state. Most of the forms of the state in London or Berlin or Paris, again, are fairly 19th century in nature. In that era, because of the lack of good communications tools, you had to organize bureaucracies in a vertical, siloed way, very hierarchical, Weberian, and so on. Again, if you were starting them from scratch, they wouldn't look like that at all. They would be much more horizontal as well as vertical, more project-based, again, making the most of all the different resources of intelligence in the society. And I think the big question for all of us is how, in the absence of really deep crises, can relatively stable societies change their governing systems, their machineries, to be fit for purpose. It's really hard, but if we don't, we won't get the transitions we need.
So maybe the call for innovation of the political institutions, I would like to hand that to Stefan. Maybe you can share with us your thoughts on how the possibilities of that, the opportunities for that. Would it need a crisis, or do you see any other options there as well? And then maybe also, because that's what you deal a lot with in your department, about some long-term trends in Germany and Europe regarding jobs, productivity, competition. and how value creation in the digital age is changing that. So,
how long do you want?
well, you can jump. I was just thinking that you could jump from that very difficult innovation and institutions question to the other one.
No, let me first thank the SKP and the DPZ for that inspiring event, and thanks to Geoff and Patrizia for raising the level of expectation that I have to fulfill now. I think you're I may be a little bit over optimistic about how we change our democracies, and I feel a little bit reminded of the book The Circle, where we turn everything to digital, and democracy as we know it is not important to me. I mean that to me, I mean it sounds a little dangerous, to be honest. The point that you make is well, and I know that you don't mean that, but I think it's still important to say. For the government and how a government works, I mean, certainly we come from the tradition of a very hierarchical organization, but I think it's also true, and Nesta works a lot with the British government and other governments as well. I think that changes a lot, and I mean, if you look at the policies that we're doing, and now I turn to the next point, how we try to react to the new economy, the new technologies, when you look how we change the regulatory framework in different directions. I mean, we are just engaged in creating a new competition law, which actually deals with avoiding the abuse of data of certain big tech companies. We also try to facilitate cooperation among and give legal certainty to cooperation of smaller businesses, which deal with digital cooperation as well, and things like that. On the other hand, I mean, we're not trying to tighten regulations. Actually, we try to loosen regulation or change regulation. We have a project in my department which we call regulatory sandboxes, where we actually try to change to the way we write laws, actually to implement exceptions from the laws and create processes where not deregulating, but where we have projects that actually take in the society and create examples how we could implement these digital innovations into our daily life. So there's different processes that are ongoing, I think, and this is all over the government. I mean, as you said, we're doing projections for the economy. We're working with machine learning processes at the moment. We try to get more and more data in. So I think there's much more going on in governments as well, and I think we have a lot to learn. We're not a tech company yet as the government, but I think. We try to react, and one important thing that you said about co-innovation, I think that's something that changed also in the attitude of economists, I have to say, is our attitude towards industrial policies. If you look at the latest report of the Council of Economic Advisors, they devoted a whole chapter in their report on industrial policies. A few years ago, even not the word would have shown up in such a report. So the idea that actually in this time of extreme technical uncertainty, and you said there's no blueprint for this transformation. I think this uncertainty is within the government, but it's also within business. We need a different style of government, where it's not the government that sets the framework, but we need a kind of a co-innovation between the government and businesses and society as well.
Maybe to open that business field a bit more, industrial policy and also the examples that we saw in Geoff's keynote. That's usually the big ones, and the industrial sector, or the new big corporations on the scene. Julia, contrary to those big players, to the classic ones, so to say, social entrepreneurships are the field you work in a lot. How would you get them into the picture that we have been discussing here?
Wow, so many topics. Like, I've been writing down notes and I'm like totally overwhelmed, don't know where to start, to be honest. But in the past couple of years, I've been working with grassroots communities, non-profits, also like pretty new with social entrepreneurs. And what we can see, like the scale of these new kind of social problems, we do not only need the government and grassroots initiatives, but we need entrepreneurs, social innovation in order to tackle these issues. And what are social entrepreneurs? They are driven by a mission. Their main goal is social change. So that distincts them from like startups or conventional entrepreneurs. They are working towards healthier, towards more just, towards more fair societies. And their innovations can actually hold huge potential. Earlier this year, Ashoka and McKinsey published a report where they talk about the multi-billion euro potential of these social innovations. And many of these entrepreneurs are not only focusing on getting rid of symptoms, but they're really addressing the root cause. So how can we change systems? How can we not only invent one tool, but really approach a system with our solution? And a lot of them start small. So the report is called From Small to Systemic. And what are ways that we can help these entrepreneurs scale up their innovations? And as Geoff said, that there have been a lot of investments into technology, but I believe that we need investments in new ways of organizing society, because if you have the technologies ready, the best technologies in the world, if you don't have functioning democracies and if there's resistance in society to use these technologies, then you will get nowhere. And I've also been thinking about, like the whole discussion made me think about early internet pioneers and what they've been saying about the tools that we need. Tools that actually help to augment our imagination, that help us to think big and that are not framed around efficiency, but that help us to develop new narratives and see a future in which we can collectively tackle these issues. So I think it's also a lot about new narratives, new stories, and tools for people that they can use, and access to information that they can use in order to come up with new scenarios for the future, scenarios that do not necessarily ask like, what technology do we need, but what are the problems, and then what tool or how can we tackle them?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that's a lot of the mindset as well that needs to not necessarily change, but be included in innovation processes on all sides, so to say. You addressed a few, or you touched a few examples answering that big question that we picked for this night. How can technologies add greater social or environmental value as well and be at service of society? Would Patrizia or Geoff, would you have additions to that, to what Julia just described for the social entrepreneurship side?
Well, maybe just to build on that last point Julia made. I mean, I certainly think there's a much bigger role to be played by social entrepreneurs and communities and innovators around the big challenges like just transition or on the labour market, and that requires a different style of working by governments. But I think it also needs what Julia said, which is a way of having conversations which are looking 20 or 30 years into the future, into which millions of people can take part. Mm-hmm. Last week we published a survey of what we thought were good examples from around the world, this kind of participatory futures, where it's not just done by a foresight team in the government, which is what the UK government does, but is deliberately made part of democracy. Often using the arts and theatre and digital imagination, so people can start picturing, what would a society look like with, benign AI helping us to solve our problems, or, a zero carbon living. And I think in many countries our political classes have often lost the skill of doing that. I know Emmanuel Macron's trying to a little bit in France and some others, but if we don't have a way of having an inclusive conversation about the medium-term future, people will fear the future. They will see that it is a threat to their livelihoods, which is what many people in North America and Europe feel at the moment. And then there's a more sort of mechanical things I'll just very quickly mention. So we've had quite an interesting experiment in the UK the last 2 or 3 years, which, because of our political context, was slightly painful. But it was an attempt to create a more structured partnership of government, big business, and social entrepreneurs and innovators around big challenges like mental health at the workplace, or transitions into work for young people, or financial exclusion. And actually some of the models, I think, were quite good because it tried to be much more precise of what the targets were, what each sector was going to bring. It included funding for social entrepreneurs to show what they could do, but linked into the power of big business, which on an issue like mental health or work opportunities often has more direct engagement with citizens than the government has. And say our conditions weren't ideal for that, but I feel we need some new methods of structured, systematic, and ideally measurable partnerships on big challenges. And then finally, 'cause we held an event on this last night, we've been experimenting exactly the space Stefan mentioned on what we call it anticipatory regulation. How do you regulate for very fast changing technologies where you don't know where they'll be in 2-4 years' time? The old methods, which are very legal and very formal, don't really work. So you have to, as you said, have much more iterative interaction between the innovators and the regulators. You need sandboxes, you need experiments, you need uses of data. And we've been experimenting with the regulators actually providing money to us as Nesta and others to come up with new ways of, for example, providing legal services or banking services, but with the regulators involved so they remove the barriers. If regulation is the barrier to a useful innovation, they're involved from the start. And this is actually working really well. We have a regulatory innovation fund in the UK, funding dozens of these. And 5 years ago, I thought we'd have no hope at all of changing regulators, because they tend to be very, very conservative and traditional. But actually, with a bit of financial incentive, they've really changed.
Okay, the financial impulse. Maybe also to a German perspective, because that was a UK example. Could you imagine that model working here, or who would have to set the impulse to innovate the measures needed, the formats needed, the platforms needed, maybe? Open question to any of the 3 German panelists.
I mean, I'm sometimes wondering, like, what infrastructure do we need in order to build these tools, tackle these challenges? The Greens have been talking about a European social network, which might be an interesting idea, but then on what infrastructure do you build these technologies, right? So, and I think that's an interesting way of looking at things, and also asking who is going to provide the technical infrastructure? How can cities, states build this infrastructure? I've been to Turin 2 weeks ago, where the Decode project presented their results, and there have been wonderful works coming out of this EU project. The city of Barcelona, for example, set up this Ideen, a platform for participatory governance and for deliberation. And it was not only the city who built this platform, but a collective of stakeholders, of companies, of social innovators, of civic tech folks. So they built the infrastructure for the city that we can base these new ideas and tools upon. And I think that's a really interesting example and concept. And I think this is something that the code is open source, that German cities could redeploy and use. So there's not even a huge financial stake in using these technologies. They are ready to use out there. Yeah.
When it comes to participatory processes, I think one of the biggest challenges how to combine sort of very creative, sort of deep conversations with big scale. And so I think one of the biggest challenge is how to use technologies on the one hand side, on the other hand, how to unleash exactly the dimensions of intelligence which machines can't do, like creativity, judgment, wisdom. And that's why you use theater often or experiments, because I think we have to increase this capacity of human beings, because the other one is taken up by machines. So we have to see how we can build these two and combine these two dimensions. And that's one point. And for this, you need also a state who is able to deal with this. And so I would like to respond to you, because of course I think I can speak for myself, and then you might add if you want. It's not to say, at least in my vision, that we can do without the state and everything has to be sort of bottom up and there's no time, no idea of steering things. And precisely because you want the state to be able to act and to be able to take responsibility, because it's a question of responsibility in our democracies today, you have to develop it further, which does not mean to sort of go away with norms like freedom, equality, and all that. Of course, you have principles, and you need to see what it means today and how you can reinvigorate precisely the principle you want to have in place. So it's not, I don't want to have either or and to say, oh, this is sort of undemocratic and they want to get rid of the state. No, we have to reshape the state, which doesn't mean to get rid of it, right?
If I may add on that and just reply. I mean, I think when you talk about participatory processes, and you're exactly right. If you look, we have the discussion with the finance ministry all the time, and international organizations that Germany is not investing enough in infrastructure. And the usual reply is, well, we don't have the planning capacities. What we have is a great resistance in all communities against new infrastructure projects. Look at wind energy, look at new highways, whatever, digital infrastructure, whatever you look at. And I think using the intelligence of people to solve these problems and to find solutions, I think that's very useful, and I think that's where we can make more process, maybe using these new technologies and new formats, like the government as a platform. I like that expression. But at the local level, I think that really makes sense to have a government that is responsive to the needs of people. Maybe one more point to to social entrepreneurship, I think, which is very important, and also, to be honest, the economics ministry started to recognize social entrepreneurship maybe 5-6 years ago with the help of Ashoka, and we're working together with Ashoka since then, and also have a look at this sector more intensively. And working together with social entrepreneurs. But what I would like to say is that the distinction between social entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs who are not so social. I think this is a mistake. I mean, if you look at the German system, like we have a lot of family-run ownership entrepreneurs who actually rather have a long-term view on their business and are very much embedded in local societies. So, and maybe not so much capital market driven. That's one thing in the German model. And the second is, if you look at sustainable finance, which is actually, I think, a very, very interesting field where you have investment companies who actually focus on green technologies, and they are not investing into coal and dirty technologies anymore, and they're not doing that because they're forced to, but they're doing that for commercial reasons. So what I see also in business and entrepreneurship, there's a movement actually towards more sustainable investments, more responsible entrepreneurship, which is driven by the needs of technology, I think, also because businesses see that if you don't have the acceptance in society, you cannot survive as a business. So I think there's a big change going on at the moment that we're observing, and technology is driving that.
Maybe Julia wanted to react as well, and I would invite you to do that if you want, and then afterwards open up the discussion for the...
Yeah, I mean, when we look at this systemic approach, like what I've been thinking a lot is also, what about the externalities of new tech? So when you take Bitcoin, for an example, right, and ask yourself, is this alternative way of doing financial transaction worth the environmental cost? Or if you look at services like Uber, super convenient for some people to get from door to door in an affordable way, but you also have to take into account the environmental effects when people move from transport systems back to cars. So what are consequences, like even though people claim, yeah, tech for good, what are the externalities and what are the consequences that sometimes are not seen while we develop these technologies, and how can we realize like earlier or sooner like what potential consequences could look like. And I think there it would be important, and I mean that's a narrative that like a lot of us touched upon, to increase diversity, to have more stakeholders around the table that can give insights on tools and developments, to have citizens from all age ranges present and give their input on developments. Yeah. So this is one point that I would like to also discuss.
And also educational or empowerment structures for this new diverse set of stakeholders. Yeah. That's what I also took away from your remarks. Thank you. I would, in fact, give you the opportunity to ask some questions as well. So if you have one, please raise your hand. I'll try to... Do we have a microphone over there? I'll hand you mine, and then we have one there and one there.
Sure. Yes. Hi, Tobias Stapf. Sounds silly in English. And a question for Geoff Mulgan. I'm very sorry, it's going to be a question about Brexit. But I guess it's a bit the elephant in the room for me, because I wonder whether you think digital social innovation could have done anything to prevent, you know, because I mean, in a way, what we're talking about has, in large parts, already happened. You know, the shit already hit the fan. Cambridge Analytica in the US and the UK. So I guess we're, you know, trying to catch up with that. Yeah, and I guess with your insight into political developments and the innovation fields, I was just wondering about your perspective on this.
Shall I try and answer that? So I think when historians look back in 50 years' time, they will definitely say that digital technology did play a part in Brexit, but in several different ways. So one is that the people who voted for Brexit, some of them were actually, majority were fairly affluent, traditional conservative voters. But there was also another group of working class voters who felt very disempowered by a whole series of trends of automation, job loss, wage pressure, which was a certain kind of digitization strategy in which they'd had no say, their interests weren't taken account of, they felt out of control, and voting for Brexit was one way of asserting as a negative response to that, in a way quite a rational negative response. And then the other way, as you say, was the fact that we allowed a whole set of models of social media to become the norm on Twitter and Facebook without any proper regulation, without any countervailing forces. In retrospect, that will look like a disastrous thing to have happened. And our current election in the UK is, if anything, worse. We have no protections against Russian interference. We've had a whole series of ridiculous stunts of fake news, including by our ruling party, in the last day or two. So it's just, again, proving we have governance sinkholes. We have just missing bits of good lawmaking, the state playing the role the state has to play, which is then allowing malign effects to come about. So, yes, is a short answer to your question.
There's a report pointing out the interference for the Brexit polls, and that is being kept by the government. I find that remarkable.
So do we. It's a report on Russian interference in the referendum, which the government has suppressed, because it will show a number of, it will show there was a lot of interference, and a series of, anyway, it's a long story, but funders of the current ruling party are named in the report. Russian
Directing
funders.
away from Brexit, maybe.
Yeah.
The second question was, sorry, somewhere there. The mic comes from behind, to your right, yes.
Thank you, with my Alex. I heard quite a lot of interesting words, jingles. At first, I heard a lot of value creation, but are those most valuable digital companies you showed in your chart, are they really good at value creation, or are they good at value extraction? And is what the stock exchange is valuing and seeing as a value, is this value creation or value extraction? So I think those questions are a bit on core of our problems to get really a new side of what's happening economically. And I think as long as we are not really trying to and having results on these questions, we are always are moving like grass in the wind. Yes, value creation, it's a lot of digital things moving on, but are there really those value creators we are talking about? And the second one is about co-regulation. Are we perhaps at the moment at a point where projects like Facebook's Libra is something they're trying to overtake social and governmental functions and trying to regulate the other way around? Thank you.
Could I turn your question into a question to you, the rest of the audience? Because I think Google is a really interesting example. Some of its business models is almost entirely advertising based. And to some extent, that is a predatory model, taking your data, selling it, making money out of you. But also, every now and again, surveys are done asking people how much, if Google was taken away, search engines, Gmail, what would you be willing to pay to have it back? I don't know what your answer would be. On average, people will answer a very large sum of money. So a huge amount of value, I think, is being created by the Googles of this world. Which is pure creation, makes our lives easier in lots of ways. But there's also an element of predation as well. And that's why the policy challenge is quite complex. You want to keep the benefits, which is why I don't actually support lots of competition policy which just breaks them up into small pieces. That seems to be a really backward-looking solution. But you also want to stop them having the capacity to act in predatory ways, which now all of those big companies are doing. And that's a natural dynamic of capitalism. It always has been. Each industrial revolution creates new, very successful companies. They create lots of useful value for people, and then they overshoot because they become too powerful and start becoming more predatory. And at that point, governments have to respond with clever policy. And on Libra, I think Facebook will fail in its attempt. It definitely was an attempt to bypass state sovereign control over money supplies, and because states are not stupid, they have essentially blocked it, as far as I can see so far.
Yeah, comment from Stefan.
Yeah.
On that maybe.
Maybe if I may add on that, I think it's, but it's also a serious discussion. I mean, I'm not, discussing splitting up Google or something. I think you're right that it's a very backward-looking policy. But I think we have to consider to what extent certain services that those companies deliver perform the function of public goods. And that's what your graph, which was on very shortly and didn't see it. So we have to think of what data services should be maybe not delivered by governments or by the state, or should at least be, whether we should have a trusted area for data or something. And that's actually a project that we're following up in my ministry. We have a European trusted cloud, which we call Gaia X, where we try to provide an environment where actually citizens, but also small companies, are not afraid to deliver their data to work, and to actually open up to digital technologies quicker, because they're not afraid of losing their data sovereignty.
I would like to add something. I think that the backbone of democracy is the public sphere. The public sphere is now, to a large extent, in digital, right? So, and many people have asked the governments to create a democratically organized public sphere in the internet, which didn't happen, as you know. So one of your collaborators, by the way, whom I happen to know, now works for Facebook. He's a law person. And he is looking at how he could regulate within Facebook, and trying to it's basically constitutional thinking of new lawmaking. and he wants to transfer it to the public once he has learned it in the private sector, right? But I do find it quite deploring that the movements I see within companies like Facebook is more forthcoming than governments at the moment. So I think that we really need to rethink not only questions of hate speech and fake news, of course, but also questions of how to break the echo chambers of social media and so on and so forth.
But I mean, the question is why companies are more forthcoming. They're forthcoming in this respect because they're forced to, because they feel the pressure and the opposition from governments, from citizens.
Of course, but
So
I think at one point the state has to think about regulation in a much more forceful way.
Sure.
Okay.
We had good to watch. We had a question back there.
So yeah, thank you for this very interesting panel and also for putting it together. My name is Morris. I work on risk assessment for emerging technologies. I'm very concerned with externalities. I always find it quite concerning. Like, we are always very fast in talking about innovating on policy, innovating on the state. What a challenge, yeah? Like a really big construct. But we are very shy on innovating on the economic model or economic system, which basically brings up those dynamics which we have right now. Because it's not an externality which is just coincidental, unintended consequence. It's something which we take willingly as a risk. We accept this risk because we have a dividend which we get out of it and we exploit. We are accepting exploitation of data, like we accept the exploitation of nature also, yeah, it's also because of climate change, very willingly. So, and then we always are very fast to take up this big challenge to take on policy, governmental, the entire state, yeah. But what about the economic model? Maybe you have a couple of answers for me there.
To someone specific, or to the whole panel, the question?
Maybe to you, Geoff, because
Maybe to you, Geoff, maybe especially in the context of like the value comment you made to the previous.
So I agree with the spirit of your question. I think that this should be maybe Juha will talk about this later. I think we should be doing more conscious, deliberate experiment around economic models. The Decode event, which Julia mentioned, was a project we've been involved in for several years, deliberately trying to demonstrate new ways of organizing data ownership at a city level, mainly in Amsterdam and Barcelona. And in a way it was to explore a different kind of economics, where a lot of the data would be both organized as a commons, but also with more citizen control. Now, if that became general, obviously the rest of the digital economy would have to change its business models in quite radical ways. There's a lot of work globally on new kinds of commons, both intangible commons like in data and knowledge, but also tangible commons like land or forests and so on.
Ocean.
And exactly, and the oceans are probably the most important. And I think we will see hopefully new experiments in the governance, the management of value of those commons, because that sits alongside a very market-driven competitive economy, and yet in many places the commons have been squeezed in unhealthy ways, and I think in the digital world that's definitely happened. But as you say, I think perhaps in the last 20 years governments felt very uncomfortable experimenting or supporting experiments in the economy. They thought that was purely the role of the private sector. But I think that has shifted now. I think, as you say, there is a more of an appetite, not just for industrial policy and missions and challenges, but also for rethinking some of the DNA of capitalism. How do we get it better aligned with both the ecological imperatives, but also the human and the social? Are you're happy doing that? Yeah, experimenting with capitalism.
Well, experimenting with capitalism. Well, I mean, even the not conservative, but the traditional Financial Times, had a big front page of in yellow and says, we have to go beyond capitalism, certainly. But I think, what we shouldn't. You say experimenting with capitalism and environmental or social dimensions. I think what we saw is, and that's very traditional economics, that the air, the environment didn't have a value. So what we have to do, and that's politics, it's not the economy, we have to assign a value to those goods. And then, as we do in emission trading, and which is imperfect, but it's improving. So this is very traditional economics. Or if you have social externalities of certain enterprise behavior, then you have to internalize this by having social insurances and similar things. So it's not the capitalist model in itself. It's the framework in which it works. And this is always imperfect, but the politics have to provide the framework and has to improve it constantly to make it work better.
I would like to add something at this point.
He doesn't agree. Sorry.
No, just a question: is it possible? Sorry. Is it actually possible in a sphere which we see where we have territorial interests, like we have with GDPR? But in a sphere which extends across regulatory borders at the moment. So it's a very global phenomenon. It's very hard to regulate this globally.
So my big anxiety about Europe is, I actually think GDPR was a good thing, but I think Europe will put too much weight on laws and rules as the way to solve data, and now AI. There will be a set of policies on AI announced at a European level early next year, and I'm almost certain they will be done through a lawyer's mind. Whereas actually almost everything on AI is about trade-offs. There will be a trade-off of privacy and public benefit and so on. And I think we need institutions, governance institutions, which are accountable but make those trade-offs. And if we go too far on the legal route, it will actually inhibit Europe's capability, technological capability. We will lose out on lots of ability to solve problems. And I think it will look like a historic mistake, and we will become dependent on Chinese and American technology, which we will import. Now, this is a debate not happening at all in Europe at the moment, and yet in the next 6 months we will probably set the direction of travel on the most important technologies of our times. So that might be a good topic for this forum to look at, because it looks well-intentioned, it looks perfectly sane, applying human rights principles, legal principles to AI. It just happens, I think, to be a misstep. Someone must disagree with that.
No, I have a different point and a different point to Geoff, and I'm with you all the way what you presented there, and I think the UK is far ahead of Germany in terms of thinking about these things, but also approaching them strategically. I mean, there's no Nesta organization in Germany. There's nothing like a social innovation policy. There's nothing like even a social entrepreneurship policy, really, by the German government. So in many ways, you're a step ahead, and a big step ahead of us.
But we're going backwards fast.
Yeah,
I guarantee that.
That could be true, but the point I want to say is that, if you look at the programs, and when you say, you start cooperating with business, but also with policymakers, and in terms of a technological approach, to work on social issues such as mental health, social exclusion, poverty, etc. At the same time, we can see that the countries who are further ahead in the sort of digital transformation are also countries which have more social problems rather than less social problems. So to some extent, there might be also an advantage of being a more traditional society, which I would the German society I would say is more traditional in that sense, and not that far along the road in the digital transformation. But it is also, when it comes to certain social indicators, it might be better off. And I'm wondering whether there's a connection between the two. And if there is a connection between the two, is there a way, if we can shape the digital transformation without losing some of the social inclusiveness which traditional societies still have?
So I don't know if any of you read the World Happiness Report 2019, which is actually it's a good survey now done quite regularly on the happiness of different countries. Now, you can all guess which country comes top. It's Juha's country, Finland. And the next few are mainly North European countries, which are extremely digital. They're also top of any ranking on digital. They have strong social supports, etc., etc. So I don't accept the premise that being more digitally advanced makes you weaker. There's also another really interesting pattern in the World Happiness Report, which if you then look at what things correlate with getting a good happiness score, income matters, yes, obviously, GDP per capita, life expectancy and health matters, but the one factor which matters more than either of those is the strength of social supports, the quality of, how many people can you rely on. And this is why I'm obsessed with social innovation. Our UK funders of innovation and research have never funded anything addressing social support and those sort of bonds, and yet this is the single most important determinant of human well-being. And digital can weaken those. So that's where I probably agree with the thrust. And in the US, as I said, the spread of the internet paradoxically coincided with weakening social connections. Our collective job is how do we get the best out of digital, but also really attend to the strength of social relationships, because in the long run that matters as much as the GDP Stefan delivers or the health that hospitals deliver. And yet it's weirdly been a blind spot of governance, and it's been a blind spot of R&D and technology policy for the last 50 years.
I will take a last question here, and everyone else will have to try and catch up with one of the panelists later. And maybe to the panel, if you could, in the answer, whoever answers, include that one key topic we should be focusing on during our next workshop events, and just then hand it around so we do a closing round with this last answer as well.
Well, I hope this last question is maybe not one which is too big, because I would like to talk about another big sinkhole that has not yet been explicitly mentioned. So, I mean, the question is just what does it mean to be digitally advanced? So we are talking now about shaping of power data concentrations in favor of public interests, and we're dealing with socio-technical systems. So the big sinkhole I mean here is the thing that Mr. Edward Snowden called our permanent record. And basically, wouldn't we need a fundamental paradigm shift in, let's say, 3 points? So first, it would be to abolish what Shoshana Zuboff and also Edward Snowden call the surveillance capitalism model, which we face currently, which is run by corporations and the state. So we need to talk not only about the big five, also about the 5 I's. Second question, maybe also to abolish data colonialism concerning global digital inequalities, concerning training data, taking out our digital rubbish, etc., pp. So this is Nick Holdry and Ulysses Mejias. And third, shouldn't we also talk about the value extraction model of big tech, when big tech is also working in favor of big oil? So 3 final questions. I hope they are not too big, maybe to all of you.
Maybe we can pick.
It's difficult to answer these complex questions, but I would like to say in a more general terms, and I think we have discussed that in the High Tech Forum with you also. In Germany, you often hear, oh, we're going to be sustainable, and we're going to be this and that, and we just, for the transition or for the transformation, we need innovation and growth. You hear that quite often, like a mantra, right? But perhaps we get the mains and the aims, the needs and the ends clear. I mean, I don't think that technology or growth would be an end in itself, of course. We need to know what is the end in itself and how can we align our technologies to a sustainable society, to a sustainable way of living, and also of having an economy. Yeah? And then this brings me to your point. I think I'm not so sure whether it's very helpful to think in trade-offs. I don't think there's a trade-off between artificial intelligence and human rights. I think you have to think how we want to live in 20, 30 years. What are the principles, the normative principles, which go hand in hand, and how artificial intelligence can align with these norms. It's different to think in terms of trade-offs, right? And I think we should make quite clear what is the end and where we want to arrive and what is the means. And once we have that clear, we come out of this sort of very economic way of thinking in trade-offs.
So a call for scenarios during the next
Well, again, it
workshops?
depends how you do the scenarios. If you do it in a way that you extract the scenarios of the future from the past or from the present, as is often done, and then of course you go nowhere. But if you think from the future, and so you need to create experiments to make that happen, then you are much more open to what can be, and you can steer creativity in a different way.
Okay.
I would agree with that, but with just one qualification. I think once you've done that, it's very unlikely that you have a series of clear principles which you can then logically deduce what your rules should be on data or AI. I think it's much fuzzier and more blurred than that. And yet some of the people trying to shape EU AI policy at the moment are thinking it is a deductive process from principles. That's all I was challenging.
Okay, great. Yeah. Then we are in line.
Okay. Two more impulses for the next events we're going to have for the.
I actually also noted like preferable futures, like thinking about like new narratives and scenarios, but not only with policymakers, politicians, with artists, with young people, with people who might not know what stands behind AI, but who might ask the right questions to decision makers and people in power, and who might come up with scenarios that are detached from the past as we know it and surveillance capitalism as we know it right now, because I think we need to leave these narratives and need more people to get involved into these discussions for sure.
Thank you.
Maybe a similar point, I think, I mean, if you have a chance maybe to get more concrete and maybe, you know, look at the second half of the population which does not and will not enjoy the rents of these new technologies to the extent as all these people who are in this room are actually enjoying it. And maybe to get out of, you know, maybe go to another city, maybe go to the countryside and talk about people with that, because all the people who are here are involved in these jobs. And I think, I mean, even in the future, as much as digital as it will get, we will still have plumbers and we still eat food and we still live in houses. So there's another part of the economy which, you know, will probably benefit from technologies, but how can we make sure that it really benefits? And that's why I'd like to see in the project to get more concrete. How can we actually include those parts of the population that is not digital native?
Could I also have a 30-second thought of a topic for your future forum?
And then hand to Juha.
Yeah, and that's, I think in the next 5 years there's going to be a lot of demand for ideas on global governance of digital. We become much more aware of the commons of ecology, climate, oceans and so on, and the need for governance, guardianship, curation. I think the same applies to our shared commons of digital infrastructures. They're missing governance, whether on cybersecurity, data, what's embedded in AI that's traded. And there's an urgent need for thinking of solutions. And Germany could be very influential in that debate. So I would strongly urge you to take that topic on. And I'm publishing a paper on this next month with some ideas, which you may disagree with.
Thank you. What's the Finnish perspective on that? Maybe we can put it like that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the panel. Thank you all. Guten Abend. It's an honor to have the opportunity to either repeat or synthesize what has been said. And I was also asked to give a little bit of a Nordic flavor, which I guess means being very pragmatic about everything I say. To give a little bit of a perspective, I remember very well 7 years ago, today is the first day of Slush, which is nowadays the biggest European startup conference. So today, 25,000 people, around 3,500 startups and 2,000 investors get together in Helsinki. 7 years ago, it was quite different. It was also a lot smaller. At that time, we had initiated a program to incubate startups in housing, mobility, and food. Startups that would have more of a purpose, more of a mission in terms of providing society. And the reaction we got from Slush was quite strong. They didn't see how startups in housing, mobility, and food would fit the scene filled with startups on media and gaming. So the scene in startups has changed enormously. Today, when Slush started, the theme of Slush is impact for the society. Today was also the launch of the State of the European Tech Report, which stated that this year there's 4.4 billion euros of investments for purpose-driven startups, however that is defined. And secondly, around 12% of investments are towards purpose-driven startups. And that's twice as many as in any given year before. So the scope in terms of the pace we are having, in terms of having a discussion and actions on Tech4Society is very, very strong. I think there are two reasons that were referred to in this discussion here today. First one is that we've started to understand the scope of societal challenges we're facing and the fact that the existing solutions might not necessarily be sufficient in delivering answers to those. And the second is exactly the fact of negative externalities that we've started to see and feel in our societies. I would say a turning point on that was 2016, November, when Trump was elected, but of course the word from the UK that we shouldn't say that happened already before. So coming back to what was heard here today, first of all, thank you, Geoff, for an excellent presentation. I think the distinction between value creation, impact on society, and impact on policy is a very, very good one. And I want to touch upon what Patrizia said right after. I believe the quotation was, the state is not able to deal with the transformation. And for that, I think, again, context is useful. Our governance and governments are not designed for transformation. They're designed for stability. An example of that would be the previous Finnish government from 2015 to 2019 that used 0.5% of the overall budget for 4 years explicitly on societal transformation. 0.5% of the overall state budget for 4 years term. And again, going back, it took us around 200 years to build the basics of our governance structures. A lot of the 17th, 18th, 19th century was about creating the building blocks for a governance and a government that can enforce stability and societal development through that stability. Now we have less than 20 years, and we should figure out what are the basics and building blocks for a government and governance system that is enabled to deal with the transformation of the scope that we've been talking about here today. So that's one, I think, an important takeaway from today's discussions. The second one was what Julia was referring to in terms of importance of narratives. And this is quite an interesting one, because we used to have a very strong narrative and a vision on tech, almost a utopian vision from the early 2000s. Now we don't have a vision. One could say that we have a dystopia on tech. And I have a very personal take on this, because I used to work with startups before I went to work at Helsiki. And at that time, at around 2011, 2012, we sent a team to Silicon Valley to San Francisco. I remember when the team came back. I remember when every team came back from San Francisco. They left with an idea. They came back saying that they want to do Airbnb for X or Spotify for Y. So the creativity was mainly about modeling and mapping out a business model into another context. And the amount of lack of conceptual creativity was quite enormous. So it's not a surprise that we're in a reactionary mode in a discussion on Tech4Society. We don't focus on the conceptual level and the importance of thinking creatively in that space as well. For today, I think the most important thing that was said was a quote from Geoff in his presentation saying, and this is completely outside the context, with Paris Agreement, how can we link digital to support it? So essentially, not thinking digital in a separate domain, but understanding that the next 20 years will be about embedding digital into societal context, whether it's housing, whether it's health, education, geopolitics. It's a completely different game and an analysis. And I think for Tech4Society discussions, the key is to realize that there are two very, very different perspectives. One is to think of different domains within tech, whether it's data, whether it's the finances behind the geopolitics of digitalization. But the other layer is to think of the influence of tech on the visions of the society that was emphasized by Patrizia as well. And that is something that has much more potential in terms of creating something that enables us to get a room full of people even larger than this in the future. Finally, two notes with Nordic flavor. The first one is that I think we do need a lot of exploration of new ideas. Geoff referred to me talking a little bit about experimentation, which I will do, because we have an interesting case of that back from 2015. We had the most conservative government coming to power in Finland, and that government launched an experiment on universal basic income. And for that to happen, you need to have a model and an approach on experimentation in place. You need to showcase the politicians how and with what ways they can start to explore new ways to renew the society. So I think we need to go rapidly beyond regulatory sandboxes, even though they are important, to have a more systematic protocol in terms of how we can enable not just innovation, but diffusion of innovation into society in ways that are beneficial for the people. The second note is a bit more historic. I would say, and many people would agree, that one of the successes of the Nordic model is the fact of a fairly cooperative economic model, which involves heavy collective bargaining. So essentially a diffusion of power to employees, to the states, to the labor, to the people who do the labor, which was a very successful model in the industrial era. It enabled a high level of trust, but also competitiveness within the economic realm of the society. Now, in the post-industrial era, that most likely will not be enough. So we need to radically rethink which are three distributions of power and what mechanisms we would have there in terms of enabling a digital society that enforces trust. One concrete example could come from the digital platform economy. Digital platforms are essentially regulatory environments, far higher resolution and efficient than state. At the same time, if you don't have publicly set goals by a democratically elected government, there's a very little legitimacy in terms of what outcomes those platforms will get. So one aspect of exploring in terms of redistribution of power could be to rethink the model in which we have a government and a digital platform to collaborate together. On a final note, Geoff mentioned in the beginning the imbalance of the power of innovation. Thank you for today. I believe we've corrected that a little bit. Thanks.